The autumn of 1821 settled over the Ohio Territory like a burial shroud, heavy, cold, and inevitable. The trees along the Muskingum River had begun their slow death, leaves turning the color of old blood and dried tobacco. In the town of Marietta, a settlement that had grown fat on stolen land and federal promises, the white men spoke of progress with the certainty of profits. They built their churches on native burial grounds and their mills where fish had once run thick as rainfall. Samuel Bridger sat on the porch of his three-story house, a monument to 30 years of successful land speculation and ruthless efficiency. At 63, his face carried the deep lines of a man who had seen violence and slept soundly afterward. His hands, thick and scarred, rested on the arms of a rocking chair built from oak that had once shaded a Lenape village he'd burned to ash in 1791. He didn't remember the village's name. He'd never learned it. The whiskey in his glass caught the afternoon light as he raised it to his lips, the amber liquid warm and familiar. Around him, Marietta bustled with the sounds of industry. Hammers on wood, the grinding of mill wheels, the shouts of men moving cargo from flatboats on the river. This was civilization, he thought. This was what they'd fought for, bled for, killed for. "Father, supper's ready." His daughter Martha appeared in the doorway, her face pale and pinched, with the chronic worry of a woman who'd married poorly and returned home. "Are you coming in?" "In a moment." His voice carried the gravel of too many years shouting orders. "I'm enjoying the evening." She hesitated, then withdrew. Bridger had that effect on people, a gravitational pull that made them either orbit or flee. He'd been a militia captain during the Indian Wars, a hero in the eyes of the settlement. The stories he told at the tavern grew more elaborate with each telling. Ambushes survived, scalps taken, villages reduced to smoke and silence. He never mentioned the children. What Bridger didn't know, what he couldn't know, because men like him believed the world belonged to them simply because they took it, was that he'd been watched for 30 years. Every day, every season, through summers that burned and winters that killed, through marriages and funerals, through profits and losses, someone had been keeping count. In the woods beyond the settlement's edge, where the white men's axes had not yet reached, a figure moved through the shadows with the ease of smoke. Tenskwatawa, called Open Door by his people, was 71 years old, but age had not bent him. It had refined him, reduced him to something essential and sharp, like a blade honed to transparency. His face was a map of suffering, deep lines carved by grief, a left eye clouded white from a hunting accident in his youth, skin weathered to the color of old leather. He wore the traditional dress of the Lenape, deerskin leggings, a hunting shirt decorated with quill work that had once been his wife's handiwork, a medicine bag hanging from his neck containing sacred tobacco, dried herbs, and a piece of charred wood from the village Bridger had destroyed. Tenskwatawa had been 41 when the militia came. He remembered everything with the clarity of trauma, the sound of his brother's skull splitting under a rifle butt, his wife's scream cut short by a knife, the smell of burning corn and flesh mixing in the autumn air. He remembered Bridger's face, younger then, but unmistakable, shouting orders, directing his men to torch the longhouses, to shoot anything that moved. They'd left Tenskwatawa for dead, a musket ball lodged in his shoulder and his face half buried in mud. He'd watched his village die from the ground, helpless, drowning in his own blood and rage. But he hadn't died. The earth had held him, cradled him, kept him alive for a purpose. For 30 years, he'd lived in the spaces between worlds, neither fully among his scattered people, nor lost in the spirit realm his visions sometimes showed him. He'd become something else, patient, focused, inevitable. He'd learned every inch of the land around Marietta, every deer trail and river crossing, every hollow tree and hidden cave. He'd watched Bridger build his fortune, marry his wife, raise his children, bury his wife, grow old and comfortable. And he'd waited. The Lenape believed in the power of patience, in the slow working of justice through the natural order. Tenskwatawa had taken that belief and forged it into something harder, colder. He'd become the living embodiment of a debt unpaid, a wound that refused to heal, a promise made in blood and ash. He stood now at the edge of the forest, watching Bridger's house through the gathering dusk. He'd stood in this exact spot hundreds of times, invisible to the white men who never looked closely at the woods, who saw only timber to be cut and land to be cleared. They didn't understand that the forest watched back, that it remembered, that it kept its own accounts. Tenskwatawa's fingers traced the medicine bag at his chest. Inside, wrapped in deerskin, was a lock of his brother's hair, the only piece of him he'd been able to recover from the ashes. Beside it, a carved bone bearing the mark of his clan, the wolf, and the charred wood, black and brittle, still smelling faintly of smoke after 3 decades. These were his anchors, his reminders, his covenant with the dead. He'd tried the white man's justice once, in those first raw years after the massacre. He'd gone to the territorial governor, speaking through a translator, asking for Bridger to be held accountable. The governor had looked at him with the mild annoyance of a man bothered by a fly, and told him that the militia had been acting in self-defense, that the Indian wars were regrettable but necessary, that this was the price of progress. The translator hadn't even bothered to soften the words. That was when Tenskwatawa had understood. There would be no justice from these people. Their laws protected only themselves. Their God blessed only their conquests. Their courts were theaters where the outcome was written before the trial began. So he'd turned to older laws, older gods, older methods. He'd spent years studying the sacred practices his grandfather had taught him, the ways of moving unseen, of reading the land's voice, of calling on the spirits that dwelt in water and stone and root. He'd fasted until his body became transparent, until he could feel the earth's heartbeat through his feet, until his dreams showed him paths that existed only for those willing to walk them. He'd learned patience from the oak that takes a century to grow, cruelty from the wolf that hamstrings the deer before feeding, precision from the spider that waits motionless in its web until the fly struggles into reach. And now, finally, the time had come. Bridger would die soon. Tenskwatawa could see it in the way the old man moved, the labored breathing, the way he favored his left side. Disease or age would claim him within months, perhaps weeks. If Tenskwatawa waited any longer, the debt would go unpaid. The dead would remain unavenged, and the weight of broken promises would crush him. But he wouldn't kill Bridger quickly. That would be mercy, and mercy was not what the dead demanded. He would make Bridger understand what he'd done, make him feel every life he'd taken, every child he'd burned, every future he'd stolen. He would bury the white chief alive, not in darkness and silence, but in memory and truth, in the accumulated weight of 30 years of grief, crystallized into ritual. As darkness fell over Marietta, Tenskwatawa melted back into the forest, moving with the silence of mist. He had preparations to make, ceremonies to perform, spirits to consult. The earth itself would be his ally in this, the patient, remembering earth that held the bones of his people and waited like him for accounts to be settled. In his house, Samuel Bridger finished his whiskey and went inside for supper, never looking back at the woods, never feeling the weight of eyes that had watched him for 3 decades, never suspecting that his past, patient, relentless, inevitable, had finally come to collect. The first sign came 3 days later, though Bridger didn't recognize it as such. He woke before dawn to find his best hunting dog dead in the yard, its throat cut with surgical precision, its blood forming strange patterns in the dirt, patterns that might have been random, might have been deliberate, might have been a language he'd never learned to read. The dog hadn't made a sound. Nothing had disturbed the household's sleep. "Wolves!" Bridger told his daughter when she found him staring at the carcass, "or some damn Indian who doesn't know the wars are over." But his voice carried less certainty than his words. Martha wrung her hands. "Should we tell the sheriff?" "And say what? That an animal died?" He nudged the dog with his boot, carefully avoiding the blood. I'll bury it myself. No need to involve anyone. Moo. What he didn't tell her was that the patterns in the blood looked almost like words, like warnings, like accusations written in a script older than any language he knew. What he didn't tell her was that he'd seen similar marks once before, 30 years ago, carved into a medicine pole outside a Lenape village, the night before his militia had attacked. He'd burned that pole with everything else. The second sign came that evening. Bridger went to his study, a room lined with ledgers documenting 30 years of land deals, timber sales, and government contracts, to find every single book open to blank pages, as if someone had carefully turned them all to emptiness. His safe stood open, its combinations somehow known, but nothing was missing. Not the gold coins, not the land deeds, not the banknotes. Someone had been inside his locked house, inside his locked room, inside his locked safe, and had taken nothing except his sense of security. "Martha!" His shout rattled the windows. "Did you go through my study?" She appeared in the doorway, pale and frightened. "No, Father, I haven't touched." "Then who the hell opened everything?" He grabbed a ledger, its pages fluttering emptily. "These were closed this morning." "I know they were." "Maybe you forgot." "I don't forget." His hands shook slightly as he set the book down. "Lock every door tonight, every window. Bar them if you have to." That night, Bridger didn't sleep. He sat in his study with a loaded rifle across his lap, watching the shadows shift across the walls, listening to the house settle and creak around him. Every sound was a potential intruder. Every silence was worse. Just before dawn, he heard it. A voice singing in a language he hadn't heard in 30 years, the words rising and falling in a rhythm that bypassed thought and struck directly at memory. It was coming from outside, from the woods, carrying clearly through the cold October air. The song spoke of death and justice, of debts unpaid and graves uneasy. Even without understanding the words, Bridger understood the meaning. He went to the window, rifle ready, but saw nothing except the dark mass of the forest and the first grey light of morning bleeding across the horizon. The singing continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against his ears. When Martha came downstairs that morning, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table, the rifle still in his hands, his face grey with exhaustion, and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. "Father, we're leaving." His voice was flat, decisive. "Pack what you can. We're going to Zanesville until this passes." Until what passes? But he didn't answer. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? How could he tell his daughter that the past, a past he'd buried under 3 decades of prosperity and respectability, had somehow crawled out of its grave and was standing at his door? They spent the day preparing to leave. Bridger hired 2 young men from town to escort them, both armed, both unaware of what they were guarding against. As they loaded the wagon, he found himself constantly watching the forest, searching for movement, for signs, for the thing that had been haunting his periphery. Nothing, just trees and shadows, and the ordinary emptiness of wilderness. They left at sunset, taking the road east towards Zanesville. The wagon creaked and groaned under their belongings, the horses snorting nervously in the cold air. The 2 hired guards rode ahead, rifles across their saddles, joking quietly about women and whiskey. Bridger sat beside Martha on the wagon seat, the rifle still in his hands, his eyes scanning constantly. Every dark shape was a threat. Every bird's cry was a signal. Every breath of wind carried menace. "Father, what's wrong?" Martha's voice was small, frightened. "What's happening?" "Nothing." The lie came automatically, just being cautious. They were 2 miles from town when the road ended. Not literally. The dirt track continued ahead, winding through the forest, but something about it changed. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The light, though it should have been fading gradually into dusk, seemed to darken all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain. The horses stopped, trembling, refusing to move forward despite the driver's urging. One of the hired guards turned back, his face puzzled. "Mr. Bridger, the horses won't..." That's when the forest came alive, not with animals, though Bridger's first instinct was to look for wolves or bears. No, this was something else, a presence, a weight, a sense of being surrounded by something vast and patient and utterly implacable. The trees seemed to lean inward. The shadows deepened impossibly. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath came out in white clouds. And then the singing started again, all around them, rising from every direction at once. Not one voice but many, a chorus of the dead, the words in Lenape washing over them like cold water. The horses panicked. The wagon lurched violently as they tried to bolt, throwing Martha against Bridger. The guards shouted, fighting to control their own mounts, and through it all, the singing continued, relentless, accusatory, closing in. Bridger raised his rifle, but there was nothing to shoot. The forest pressed in from all sides, but he could see no one, nothing except shadows that moved wrong, that seemed to have weight and intention. One of the guards fired his rifle into the woods. The shot echoed, then died. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The singing had stopped. In the sudden quiet, Bridger heard footsteps, calm, measured, approaching from ahead. A figure emerged from the darkness between the trees, walking with the slow certainty of someone who had all the time in the world. Tenskwatawa stepped into the center of the road. He looked older than death, his face a landscape of suffering, his white eye catching the last light like a pearl. He wore traditional dress that seemed to ripple and shift in the gathering darkness. And around his neck, Bridger could see a medicine bag decorated with symbols that pulled at memory. The old Lenape shaman stopped 10 feet from the wagon and spoke in English, his voice like gravel and ice. "Samuel Bridger, I have waited 30 years for this moment. Do you remember me?" Bridger's mouth went dry. He raised the rifle, but his hands shook. "Stay back, you damned savage, I'll shoot." "You already did." Tenskwatawa's hand touched his shoulder, where the old bullet wound still ached on cold mornings. "October 17th, 1791. You left me for dead in the mud while my village burned. But the earth held me, the dead held me. They wouldn't let me pass until I fulfilled my promise." "That was war," Bridger said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "The governor authorized—" "Authorized?" The word came out like a curse. "You authorized yourself to burn children alive. You authorized yourself to rape and murder. You authorized yourself to destroy everything my people had built over centuries. And now you speak of law." Martha clutched her father's arm, terrified. The hired guards had their rifles trained on Tenskwatawa, but neither seemed willing to fire. Something about the old shaman's presence stopped them, a weight, an authority that transcended weapons. "What do you want?" Bridger's voice cracked. "Money? Land? I can give you—" "You have nothing I want." Tenskwatawa took a step closer. "You stole everything worth having 30 years ago. What I want now is justice. What I want is for you to understand what you did. What I want is for you to feel for just one night what my people felt when you came with fire and death." He raised his hands, and the forest responded. The darkness deepened, the air grew colder, and from all around Bridger heard voices, not singing now, but whispering, calling, accusing. He heard the screams of the village, the crack of burning wood, the sound of his own laughter as he'd given the order to torch the longhouses. He heard everything he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't real. This is real." Tenskwatawa's laugh was terrible. "What is real, White Chief? Your laws that protect murder? Your God that blesses theft? Your civilization built on graves? I will show you what is real." The shaman spoke a single word in Lenape, a word that meant earth and memory and justice all at once, and the ground beneath the wagon began to shift. The horses screamed. The guards' rifles fell from nerveless fingers. And Samuel Bridger, for the first time in 30 years, remembered exactly what he'd done, and understood that the bill had finally come due. The wagon tipped sideways as the earth buckled beneath it, spilling Martha onto the road. She scrambled away, screaming for her father, but Tenskwatawa raised a hand and she froze, not from force, but from the sudden, overwhelming certainty that moving would be dangerous, that the old shaman's attention was a weight that could crush if focused. "The woman may leave," Tenskwatawa said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This debt is not hers. She was born after the burning, innocent of her father's crimes. She may go." Martha looked at Bridger, her face torn between terror and loyalty. "Father, go!" Bridger's voice was hollow. He dropped the rifle, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "Go back to town. Tell the sheriff." But he stopped, because what could the sheriff do? What law governed this moment? What authority could intervene in an accounting 30 years overdue? "Tell them," Tenskwatawa continued, speaking to Martha but keeping his eyes on Bridger, "that your father will return when he has learned what needs to be learned. Tell them not to search. Tell them that the forest keeps its own justice, and interference will bring only more death." The two hired guards needed no further encouragement. They'd already remounted their terrified horses and were galloping back toward Marietta, abandoning their employer without a backward glance. Cowards. Bridger might have called them once, but now he understood their wisdom. Some battles couldn't be won with rifles and bravado. Martha hesitated a moment longer, then ran after them, her dress catching on brambles, her sobs fading into the distance. Within minutes, Bridger was alone on the dark road with the man he'd tried to kill 30 years ago. No, not alone. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized the forest was full of figures, shapes that might have been men, might have been spirits, might have been the accumulated ghosts of everyone he'd ever wronged. They stood among the trees, silent and waiting, their presence a collective weight that pressed against his chest. "What are you going to do?" Bridger's voice cracked. "Kill me? I'm an old man. I'll die soon anyway." "Kill you?" Tenskwatawa's scarred face split into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That would be mercy, White Chief. That would be quick. No, what I'm going to do is much older, much more necessary. I'm going to bury you alive, just as you buried my people. But you won't die in darkness and silence. You'll die in memory and truth. You'll face every life you took. You'll feel every moment of suffering you caused. And when the earth finally closes over your mouth, you'll understand what you destroyed." He gestured, and the figures in the forest moved forward. Bridger tried to run, but his legs betrayed him, buckling like a new colt's. Strong hands, real hands, human hands, gripped his arms and lifted him. He was being carried deeper into the woods, away from the road, away from civilization, into a darkness that seemed to swallow sound and hope. They walked for what might have been hours or minutes. Time had lost its meaning in the suffocating dark. The figures carrying him moved with perfect certainty, never stumbling, never hesitating, as if they'd walked this path 1,000 times before. Bridger caught glimpses of their faces, young warriors with grief-carved features, old women whose eyes held accumulated rage, children, children, with expressions too old for their small faces. All Lenape, all dead, or near enough to dead that it made no difference. They stopped in a clearing he didn't recognize, though he'd hunted these woods for 30 years. A fire burned in the center, its flames casting shadows that danced like celebration. Around the fire's edge, someone had placed objects, charred wood, scraps of cloth, pieces of broken pottery, a child's doll with its face burned away, the remnants of the village he'd destroyed. "Do you recognize these?" Tenskwatawa stood before the fire, its light making his scarred face look like something carved from ancient wood. "Do you remember what these were before you turned them into ash and grief?" Bridger said nothing. His throat had closed. His heart hammered against his ribs like something trying to escape. "This," Tenskwatawa picked up a piece of charred wood, "was part of the council house where our elders met to decide matters of law and peace. You burned it with 7 old men inside, men who had survived smallpox and starvation and 50 winters in this land. They burned alive because you wanted their land." He set the wood down and picked up a piece of cloth, faded and stained. This was from my wife's wedding dress. She wore it for 3 days of ceremony when we were married, according to our traditions. She was wearing it when your men caught her fleeing the village. They raped her, then killed her, then threw her body into the burning council house. She was 26 years old. Bridger's knees gave out. The warriors holding him let him fall, but kept their grip on his arms, so he knelt in the dirt like a penitent. This, Tenskwatawa lifted the burned doll, belonged to my brother's daughter. She was 4 years old. She loved this doll more than anything in the world, carried it everywhere, slept with it every night. Your men found her hiding under a bed. They threw her into the fire while she was still alive. She screamed for her mother as she burned. Her mother was already dead. Please. Bridger's voice was a broken whisper. Please. Tenskwatawa's laugh was knife-edged. Did they say please? Did my wife say please while your men held her down? Did the children say please while they burned? Did my brother say please when you split his skull with a rifle butt? He threw the doll into the fire, where it caught immediately, flames consuming what little remained. There is no please here, White Chief. There is only truth. The old shaman began to walk around the fire, speaking in a voice that carried like prayer and accusation combined. For 30 years, I have lived with their voices. Every night they come to me in dreams. Every morning I wake to the smell of burning flesh. Every meal tastes like ash. Every breath carries their absence. You took one night to destroy my world, and I have spent 10,000 nights living in that destruction. He stopped directly in front of Bridger, looking down with his one good eye. Now it's your turn. Now you get to feel what you did. Now you get to carry their weight. Tenskwatawa gestured, and the warriors dragged Bridger to the edge of the clearing, where they dug a pit, not deep, perhaps 4 feet, but wide enough for a man to lie flat. The dirt from the excavation sat in neat piles on either side, dark and rich and smelling of earth and endings. This is your grave, Tenskwatawa said simply. Not a grave for your body, not yet, but a grave for your ignorance, your comfort, your certainty that what you did was justified. I'm going to bury you in truth, White Chief. I'm going to pile memory on top of you until you can't breathe anything except the weight of what you destroyed. They forced him into the pit. Bridger fought, but he was old and they were many, and within moments he was lying flat on his back, staring up at the night sky visible between the trees. The stars looked impossibly distant, like they belonged to a universe that had nothing to do with this moment. Tenskwatawa knelt at the edge of the pit, looking down. I won't cover you with dirt, not yet. First, you have to meet them, all of them. Every person you killed, every future you stole, every child who never grew up, every elder who never passed on their wisdom, every story that died in the flames. He began to chant in Lenape, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. The other figures joined in, their voices creating a wave of sound that washed over Bridger like cold water, and as they chanted, the darkness in the pit deepened, thickened, became something almost tangible. Faces began to appear in that darkness. Not hallucinations. Bridger knew hallucinations, knew the tricks the mind could play. These were something else, something more substantial. The faces of the dead, each one clear and distinct and accusatory. An old man with kind eyes, his skin cracking and blackening as flames consumed him. A young woman with her dress torn, her face twisted in agony. Children, so many children, their mouths open in screams that had no sound. Warriors with their skulls shattered, mothers clutching burned infants, and every single one of them looked at him, saw him, recognized him. No, Bridger whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't. Open your eyes. Tenskwatawa's voice cut through the chanting like a blade. You don't get to look away. You don't get to pretend this didn't happen. Open your eyes and see what you did. Bridger opened his eyes because he had no choice, because the weight of the command was irresistible, and what he saw broke something fundamental in his mind. He saw the village as it had been before the burning, Long houses arranged in careful patterns, smoke rising from cook fires, children playing in the spaces between buildings, women working leather, and men tending crops. He saw a community, a civilization, a people who had lived on this land for generations uncounted. Then he saw himself, younger, harder, certain, giving the order to attack. Saw his men pouring into the village with torches and rifles and knives. Saw the systematic destruction, the casual cruelty, the laughter of soldiers doing what they'd been taught was righteous work. Saw himself shoot an unarmed old man who was trying to protect a sacred bundle. Saw himself order the longhouses burned with people still inside. Saw himself turn away from a child's pleading without a flicker of mercy. Saw himself become the monster he'd spent 30 years pretending he'd never been. "I was following orders," he gasped, the words automatic, defensive. "The governor said—" "The governor wasn't there." Tenskwatawa's voice was quiet now, which made it more terrible. "The governor didn't burn my wife alive. The governor didn't crush a 4-year-old girl's skull. The governor didn't laugh while people screamed. That was you, Samuel Bridger. That was all you." The faces in the darkness pressed closer. Bridger could feel them now, cold presences that had weight and intention. They weren't trying to harm him physically, but they were drowning him in accumulated grief, in the crushing weight of lives unlived and futures stolen. He tried to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. What words could possibly be adequate? What apology could balance the scales against wholesale slaughter? What confession could resurrect the dead or heal wounds 30 years old? There were no words for this. There was only the truth, stark and terrible and undeniable. And in that truth, Samuel Bridger finally understood what he'd spent 30 years refusing to know, that he was a murderer, not a soldier, not a patriot, not a defender of civilization. A murderer, a man who had killed children for land, who had destroyed a people for profit, who had lived 30 comfortable years on the foundations of genocide. He wept then, not from fear, not from self-pity, but from the belated recognition of what he'd done. 30 years too late, he finally saw his victims as human beings, saw their deaths as losses rather than necessities, saw his actions as crimes rather than duties, and it destroyed him. Dawn came slowly to the clearing, grey light seeping through the trees like reluctant truth. Bridger had been in the pit all night, and he'd aged a lifetime. His face, once florid with health and prosperity, had gone slack and grey. His eyes, once sharp with frontier cunning, stared at nothing with the blank horror of someone who had seen beyond the veil and found only his own reflection looking back. The chanting had stopped hours ago, but the silence was worse. In the silence, he could hear the whisper of flames, the crack of burning wood, the screams that would never entirely fade. In the silence, he carried the village's destruction in his chest, like a second heart, beating grief and guilt in equal measure. Tenskwatawa sat at the edge of the pit, cross-legged, patient as stone. He looked tired, not physically tired, but soul-tired, the exhaustion of carrying rage and purpose for 3 decades. His one good eye studied Bridger with something that might have been pity, might have been satisfaction, might have been the complex mix of emotions that comes when a long-awaited moment finally arrives. "Do you understand now?" The old shaman's voice was quiet, conversational almost, as if they were discussing weather or crops. "Do you feel it? The weight of what you did?" Bridger tried to speak but could only nod. His throat was raw from screaming, from weeping, from attempting apologies that died before reaching his lips. He was hollowed out, excavated, reduced to the bare minimum of himself with all the comfortable lies stripped away. "Good. Tenskwatawa reached into his medicine bag and pulled out a handful of dark earth. "Then you're ready for the next part, the final part." He stood slowly, his old joints cracking, and walked around the pit's edge. The earth in his hand seemed to pulse with significance, with weight beyond its physical reality. "In my people's tradition, burial is not just about returning the body to the earth. It's about returning the spirit to the cycle of life, about transforming death into continuation. But some burials are different. Some burials are about teaching, about forcing truth into bones, so deep it becomes part of the land itself. He let a stream of earth fall into the pit, the dark soil landing on Bridger's chest. This earth holds the bones of my ancestors. It holds the ashes of my village. It holds the blood of everyone you killed. When I bury you, I'm not just putting dirt on your body. I'm making you part of the grief, making you part of the memory, ensuring that what you did will never be forgotten. More earth fell, this time across Bridger's face. He flinched, but didn't try to wipe it away. He was beyond resistance now, beyond the instinct for self-preservation. He'd spent the night drowning in the weight of his own crimes. A little actual dirt seemed almost merciful by comparison. "But I'm not a monster," Tenskwatawa continued, his voice taking on a strange gentleness. "I'm not you. I won't kill you and laugh about it over whiskey. I won't make your daughter watch you die and call it justice. I'm going to give you something you never gave my people, a choice." He stopped sprinkling earth and looked directly at Bridger. "You can stay here, in this pit, and I will bury you slowly. Not deep enough to kill you quickly, just deep enough that you can't escape, that you have to feel the earth pressing in, that you have time to think about every life you took while you wait for death. That is one choice, and it is justice." Bridger's eyes widened. His voice, when it came, was barely a croak. Or, Tenskwatawa said, "you can leave this pit, return to your town, and spend whatever time you have left telling the truth. Not the stories you told in taverns, not the lies you told yourself, the truth. Tell them about the children you burned. Tell them about the unarmed people you shot. Tell them that your fortune was built on murder and theft. Tell them that the Indian wars were nothing more than organized massacre of people who only wanted to live on the land their ancestors had given them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Tell them that the hero they celebrate is a murderer, and that every acre of land they farm is stolen, and that the civilization they built stands on graves so numerous they could walk from here to the Ohio River on bones alone. Tell them the truth until they hate you, until they drive you out, until your name becomes synonymous with shame. That is the other choice, and it is also justice." Bridger stared up at the old shaman, trying to comprehend what was being offered. Freedom, but at the price of everything he'd built, his reputation, his dignity, his place in the community. The chance to live, but only as a pariah, an object lesson, a living reminder of atrocity. "Why?" he whispered. "Why give me a choice? Why not just kill me?" Tenskwatawa's scarred face was unreadable. "Because I want the truth to live longer than you do. I want your confession to outlive your body. If I kill you, you become a martyr. Another white man murdered by Indians, another story that justifies more killing. But if you confess, if you spend your last days telling the truth," he trailed off, then finished quietly, "then maybe, just maybe, some small piece of my people's story survives. Maybe someone remembers that we were human beings, not obstacles to be removed. Maybe your shame becomes our memorial." The logic was devastating in its simplicity. Tenskwatawa wasn't interested in mere revenge. He was interested in memory, in forcing the truth into a historical record that had been written by the victors. He was using Bridger's guilt as a weapon against forgetting, turning the White Chief's confession into a monument more lasting than any gravestone. "I can't," Bridger's voice broke. "If I tell them what I did, what we all did, they'll destroy me. They'll—" "Yes," Tenskwatawa's voice was iron wrapped in silk. "They will destroy you, just as you destroyed us. That's the point. You will feel what it's like to lose everything, not in a single night of fire and death, but slowly, deliberately, watching everything you built crumble while people who once respected you turn away in disgust. You will become the ghost you tried to make of my people." He let another handful of earth fall into the pit. Or you can stay here and die in darkness and silence, and the truth dies with you, and nothing changes, and in 50 years no one will remember my village ever existed. Your choice, White Chief. Justice or cowardice, memorial or grave, truth or dirt. The morning light strengthened, revealing the clearing in sharp detail, the fire's remains, the sacred objects, the watching figures who had stood vigil all night. Bridger could see their faces clearly now. Not ghosts, he realized, but living Lenape who had somehow survived, who had gathered to witness this moment of accounting. They were the remnants, the refugees, the scattered survivors of a genocide that had tried to erase them completely. They stood silent, waiting for his answer. Bridger closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw two futures. One where he climbed out of this pit and returned to Marietta and began the terrible work of confession, watching respect turn to hatred as he told story after story of casual brutality. He saw himself shunned, spat upon, driven to the margins of the society he'd helped build. He saw his daughter's face twist with shame and disgust as she learned what kind of man had raised her. The other future was simpler. Stay in this pit, let the earth cover him slowly, die with his secrets intact and his reputation unsoiled. Let history remember Samuel Bridger as a hero, a founder, a man who helped tame the wilderness and bring civilization to the frontier. It should have been an easy choice. Self-preservation should have won. But something had broken in him during the long night, something that couldn't be repaired. The faces of the dead had carved themselves into his memory so deeply that he knew he'd see them every time he closed his eyes for whatever time remained. The weight of their grief had become part of him, and he couldn't simply shrug it off and return to comfortable lies. He opened his eyes and looked at Tenskwatawa. "If I do this, if I tell the truth, will you let my daughter live in peace? She's innocent. She wasn't even born when she is innocent," Tenskwatawa agreed. "And she will live unmolested. This debt is yours alone." Bridger took a shuddering breath, then another. Then, with tremendous effort, he spoke. "Help me up." Tenskwatawa's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his good eye. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief, or the complicated emotion of winning a battle that had cost 30 years to fight. He extended his hand into the pit. Bridger grasped it, feeling the old shaman's strength, the calloused palm that had held grief and purpose for 3 decades. With help from the watching warriors, he climbed out of the pit, his legs shaking, his clothes caked with earth that smelled of memory and bones. He stood in the clearing, surrounded by the survivors of the people he'd tried to destroy, and felt the full weight of what he'd agreed to do. No going back now. No comfortable lies. No respectable old age surrounded by people who called him a hero. Just truth, harsh and unadorned, for however long he had left. "One more thing," Tenskwatawa said, reaching into his medicine bag. He pulled out a small piece of charred wood, part of the council house beam, and pressed it into Bridger's palm. "Carry this. When you tell your stories, hold this and remember what it was before you burned it. Let it remind you that every word you speak must be true, because the dead are listening." Bridger closed his fingers around the charred wood. It was still faintly warm, as if it had never stopped burning, as if the fire from 30 years ago still smoldered in its heart. "Go," Tenskwatawa said, gesturing toward the forest. "Return to your people. Begin your confession. Speak until your voice breaks. Tell them everything. And know that even if they hate you, even if they drive you out, you will have done one true thing in a life built on lies. You will have given us back our humanity, even if you lose your own in the process." Bridger nodded, unable to speak. He turned and began walking toward the forest's edge, toward Marietta, toward the terrible work of truth-telling. Behind him, he heard Tenskwatawa begin to chant again, not the accusatory songs of the night before, but something else, something that sounded almost like gratitude, like relief, like the slow exhalation of breath held for 30 years. The old shaman had won, not through violence, but through something more lasting. He'd turned his enemy into a witness, transformed revenge into remembrance, made sure that even in their destruction, his people would not be forgotten. As Bridger walked through the forest, the charred wood burning in his palm like a coal, he understood that he was already buried, not in earth, but in truth, not in darkness, but in the harsh light of recognition. He was a dead man walking, a ghost of his former self, his comfortable identity already rotting away to reveal the murderer beneath. And strangely, terribly, he felt something almost like peace. The peace that comes when you finally stop running from yourself, when you accept that justice has its own timeline and arrives exactly when it means to, when you understand that some debts can never be fully repaid, but must nevertheless be acknowledged. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist. Somewhere in the distance a bird sang. The forest breathed around him, patient and eternal, and Samuel Bridger walked on, carrying his burden of truth, toward the confession that would destroy him and, in destroying him, finally give the dead the memorial they deserved. Behind him in the clearing, Tenskwatawa stood alone beside the empty pit. He was weeping. The first tears he'd allowed himself in 30 years. Not tears of grief anymore, but tears of completion, of a promise finally kept, of a weight finally shared. He took the piece of his brother's hair from his medicine bag, kissed it gently, and buried it in the earth beside the pit. Then he filled the pit slowly, carefully, speaking the names of the dead as he worked, all 143 of them, from the oldest